Quake City, November 1967. The finance minister opens the morning cable from London. Sterling has been devalued 14.3% overnight. His government held 80% of its reserves in sterling. London had personally promised, that there would be no devaluation. The British ambassador called him 2 weeks earlier to give those assurances. The assurances were lies. Kuwait loses the equivalent of 5.9% of its entire gross national product in a single weekend. Not because Kuwait made a bad decision, because Kuwait trusted the reserve currency. Here is what nobody tells you about this story. Kuwait saw it coming. Kuwait had already cut its sterling holdings from 80% down to 62% between 1964 and 1967. That was the smart money. The problem is, 62% was still enough to devastate them. This is what I study here at Fiscal Historian. And this is what keeps me up at night. Every reserve currency in history has collapsed. Not one has been permanent. The Spanish real dominated global trade for a century, then collapsed. The Dutch guilder was the most sophisticated financial instrument in the world, then collapsed. British pound sterling dominated global reserves for over a century, then collapsed. And every single one followed a specific, documented sequence. A sequence that always begins the same way. The countries on the outside get hit first, long before the core currency shows stress. Something happens to the currencies at the edges of the system. That is what I want to show you today. By the end of this video, you will know the 4 warning signs that appeared before every major reserve currency collapse in history, in the exact order they appear. You will know which ones are visible right now. And you will understand why the countries closest to the edge of today's dollar system are already showing the signs that preceded every prior transition. Stick with me. Before we go further, I am not a financial advisor. Nothing in this video is investment advice. This is forensic history, a careful examination of what the historical record actually shows. What you do with that information is your decision. The pattern when a reserve currency dies. It does not die at the center first. The British pound was still functioning fine for people in London when Kuwait was losing 6% of its national income. The Dutch guilder was still circulating in Amsterdam when the plantation economies of Suriname collapsed under the weight of guilder-denominated debts they could not repay. The erosion always starts at the edges. The peripheral countries absorb the damage first, then the damage moves inward. By the time it reaches the core, the transition is mostly complete. Same pattern, same sequence, every single time. Here are the 4 warning signs, in the order they appear. Warning sign 1. Peripheral currencies start collapsing. This is the earliest signal, not the reserve currency itself, the currencies of the countries most exposed to it. Here is how it worked with sterling. By 1964, sterling represented 83% of the official reserves of overseas sterling area countries. By 1967, that had fallen to 65%. By 1968, it was below 55%. During that entire 6-year period, sterling itself looked stable. But underneath, the countries at the edge were quietly running for the exits. Burma sold virtually its entire sterling balance in 1964 and 1965, over £50 million gone. Burmese authorities began writing gold clauses into commercial contracts, including timber trades, so they could recover losses if Britain devalued. Burma saw what was coming 3 years before the devaluation. Iraq announced plans to leave the sterling system entirely in 1958. After its revolution, South Africa cut its sterling holdings from 25% to 3% between 1955 and 1967. India went from £417 minus 1 in sterling to just £85 million over 9 years, while official communications from London said everything was fine. Now look at today. The Turkish lira has lost 80% of its value against the dollar over 5 years. The Lebanese pound has collapsed 98%. The Egyptian pound has lost 70% since 2022. The Argentine peso has been through multiple maxi devaluations in the last 3 years. The Nigerian naira lost 73% after unification in 2023. The Pakistani rupee has halved. These are not unconnected events. These are peripheral currencies under stress from dollar-denominated debt and dollar-priced commodities. They are not the dollar collapsing, but they are showing you exactly where stress in a reserve currency system always appears first. History is clear on this. When you see this many peripheral currencies cracking simultaneously, you are watching Act 1 of a sequence that has always had the same final act. Warning sign 2. Peripheral governments hold more than they can safely sell. This is the trap. And it is the most dangerous part of the pattern. When a country holds large reserves in the dominant currency, it cannot simply sell. The moment it starts selling at scale, it triggers the very devaluation it feared. So it holds, it waits, it accepts assurances from London or Washington, and then the devaluation comes anyway, and the losses are catastrophic. Kuwait had already cut its exposure nearly in half before 1967. It still lost the equivalent of 6% of its gross national product in a single weekend, because 62% was too much to exit quietly. Malaysia held the second largest official sterling balance of any government in the world. When Malaysia pressed the Bank of England for guarantees in the weeks before November 1967, they received verbal assurances. Then Britain devalued sterling, without notice, on a Saturday night. The Kuala Lumpur Stock Exchange closed the following Monday. The trust was gone. Nigeria was still holding £800 million in early 1976. Britain had made a dollar value guarantee under the Basel Sterling Agreements in 1968, in exchange for Nigeria maintaining 60% of its reserves in sterling. Then Britain unilaterally cancelled the agreements in 1974. Nigeria called it a grave act of bad faith. It received £3,756,000 in total compensation. £3 million for holding £800 million. Here is what blows people's minds about this mechanism. The trap is mathematical. The bigger your sterling position, the less you can sell. The less you can sell, the more you lose when the devaluation finally comes. The reserve currency issuer knows this. It is part of why these transitions take decades instead of days. The periphery cannot exit. It can only reduce exposure at the margins while hoping the center holds. Today, developing economies hold roughly $6 trillion in U.S. Treasury bonds and dollar-denominated assets. The question is not whether they want to reduce exposure, many do. The question is how much they can sell before triggering the very adjustment they are trying to avoid. The answer is not as much as they would like. Let that sink in. Warning sign 3. Central banks start accumulating gold. When reserve managers stop trusting the paper and start wanting the metal, that is a signal that has preceded every major reserve currency transition we have on record. Look at what happened before sterling collapsed. Charles de Gaulle openly declared in 1965 that gold was the only true international money, and began converting French dollar reserves into gold. He sent the French Navy to New York to physically collect it. Between 1965 and March 1968, the gold pool, a cooperative arrangement among major central banks to stabilize the gold price, sustained cumulative losses of $3.69 billion. United States gold reserves fell 25% in 3 years. The pool collapsed on March 17, 1968. Before that, during the Dutch guilder's long decline, there was a documented scramble for physical coins and hard metal as confidence in the Bank of Amsterdam's paper-backed system eroded. The bank had been secretly extending credit beyond its charter. When the public discovered this in the 1780s, the premium on bank money over metal coins, maintained for over a century, disappeared overnight. Now look at today. Central banks purchased 1,136 tons of gold in 2022, 1,037 tons in 2023, 1,045 tons in 2024, 863 tons in 2025. That is the fourth consecutive year well above the prior decade average of 473 tons. In 2022, 2023, and 2024 alone, central banks purchased more than 3,000 tons. In 2025, the World Gold Council surveyed central bank reserve managers. 95% expected global gold reserves to increase. 43% planned to increase their own holdings. 0% planned to reduce. 0. Poland bought 102 tons in 2025, targeting 30% of reserves in gold, specifically for national security reasons. India repatriated 100 tons from Bank of England vaults to domestic storage. China has officially reported 2,360 tons, but analysts widely believe actual holdings are far higher. In 2022, the United States and its allies froze approximately $300 billion in Russian central bank assets. Every central bank on earth watched that happen. Every one of them quietly asked, could that happen to us? Gold cannot be frozen. Gold cannot be sanctioned. Gold is the only reserve asset that carries no counterparty risk. Central banks bought gold at nearly double the historical rate for consecutive years, even as gold set 53 new all-time highs in 2025 alone. That is not speculation. That is institutional memory, operating at the highest level of global finance. Warning sign for alternative settlement infrastructure appears. This is the latest stage signal. By the time this one appears, the transition is already underway. The peripheral damage is done. The gold is moving. Now the architecture for a new system is being built. Before the dollar replaced sterling, the United States built the infrastructure first. Bretton Woods in 1944 created the International Monetary Fund and locked in the dollar-gold peg. The World Bank was established. American financial institutions expanded globally through the 1950s and 60s. By the time sterling finally collapsed in 1976, every major country already had the dollar infrastructure in place to absorb the transition. Before sterling replaced the guilder, London built its own clearing infrastructure across the 19th century, the London Stock Exchange, the Bank of England's note-issuing capabilities, and the Bill of Exchange system gave traders an alternative long before the guilder's demise was obvious. The sequence is never. Reserve currency collapses, then alternative emerges. The sequence is always. Alternative infrastructure builds quietly for decades. Then the reserve currency collapses. Now look at today. China's cross-border interbank payment system processed $24.47 trillion in 2024, 3 times what it processed 5 years ago. By end of 2025, it had 193 direct participants and 1,573 indirect participants across 189 countries. Russia's SPFS financial messaging system now has 177 foreign participants from 24 countries. China and Russia now settle 99% of their bilateral trade, $245 billion per year, in yuan and rubles, down from just 25% in 2021. The bridge platform, involving central banks of China, Hong Kong, Thailand, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia, processed $55 billion in cross-border transactions through November 2025. The Bank for International Settlements quietly withdrew from the project in October 2024, handing control to the participating nations. At the 2024 BRICS summit in Kazan, member nations launched a payment system called BRICS Pay and began exploring a settlement instrument called the unit, pegged 40% to gold and 60% to BRICS currencies. The counterpoint, because honest history requires it, dollar still sits on one side of 89.2% of all global foreign exchange transactions, according to the Bank for International Settlements April 2025 survey. That is up from 88.4% in 2022. The dollar's share of SWIFT payments hit 50.2% in January 2025. The renminbi represents just 2.1% of global reserves. There is no viable replacement currency on the horizon. The transition from sterling to the dollar took 30 years. From the guilder to sterling took over 50. Reserve currency transitions are measured in decades, not months. But here is what history actually tells us about that timeline. The peripheral damage does not wait for the transition to complete. Kuwait took its losses in 1967. The sterling area countries that held on through 1976 took additional 20% losses when sterling continued falling after it floated. Nigeria was still holding £800 million in 1976, 9 years after the devaluation it saw coming. The countries at the edge pay first, pay longest, and are still paying when it is over. The question history asks is not, is the dollar about to collapse? The historical record suggests that question will not be answered for decades. The question history asks is, where are you in the sequence? What history shows survived every prior transition? Gold verified across every transition in real terms. Gold rose from $35 per ounce in 1971 to $850 in January 1980. In British pound terms, gold rose from £14 per ounce in 1945 to over £400 by 1980. During the guilder's collapse, physical metal was the only thing that held value as the Bank of Amsterdam's paper became worthless. Equities in productive companies with foreign earnings, not bonds, not cash, equities. The Barclays Equity Gilt study covering over a century of British data shows equities return 5.1% annually in real terms, while gilts returned 1.2% and cash returned 0.8%. During sterling's decline, companies with assets and revenues denominated in foreign currencies did best. Real assets, land, real estate, and physical productive capacity. In every transition, the owners of productive physical assets came through. The holders of government promises did not. What went to zero? Government bonds denominated in the declining currency. Research by Carmen Reinhardt and Belen Sprancia for the International Monetary Fund shows that real interest rates on government bonds were negative roughly half the time during 1945 to 1980. In advanced economies, for the United Kingdom specifically, the real rate on government bonds was negative in 24 of the 30 years after the Second World War. £100 invested in British gilts in 1945 without reinvested income would be worth approximately £2 in real terms by 2014, not almost nothing. £2. And here is what should concern every holder of dollar-denominated government bonds today. As federal debt crossed $39 trillion in April 2026, interest payments hit $1.20 trillion in fiscal year 2025, nearly tripling from $345 billion in 2020. Interest now exceeds defense spending. The Congressional Budget Office projects debt rising to 120% of GDP by 2035. Britain hit those levels in 1945. It took 30 years to work through the consequences. The mechanism was financial repression, holding interest rates below inflation so the debt slowly inflated away. The people who held government bonds for 30 years paid the price. The conclusion for warning signs. All four are showing. Peripheral currencies cracking across Turkey, Lebanon, Egypt, Argentina, Nigeria. Peripheral reserve holders trapped in exposure they cannot fully exit. $6 trillion in treasury holdings that cannot be sold without triggering the adjustment. Central banks buying gold at nearly double the historical rate for consecutive years, with 95% expecting to buy more. Alternative settlement infrastructure processing trillions of dollars in transactions outside the dollar system. History is not destiny. The dollar is not about to collapse. Reserve currency transitions take decades. The dollar remains dominant by every current measure, but Kuwait in 1967 was not wrong to be concerned. Kuwait was right. It just could not exit fast enough. The question is not whether this pattern resolves. It always resolves. The question is whether you will be positioned when it does. Because that Saturday night, when Britain devalued sterling, the people who held their wealth in something solid behind the bookshelf did not need to understand reserve currency theory. They just needed to hold something the Bank of England could not devalue. The pattern is mathematical. The outcome is historical precedent. The only variable is you. I'm the fiscal historian. If you want to keep studying the autopsies before the next one happens, subscribe. It's free. Unlike financial literacy in a system designed to keep you ignorant.